Hi everyone, I am going to continue reading my book, which is The Giver of Stars by Jojo Moyes, and we are now on to chapter 12. There were certain unspoken rules of the society in Baileyville, and one lasting tenet was that you didn't interfere in the private business of a man and his wife. There were many who might have been aware of beatings in their holler, man to woman, and occasionally the other way round, but few inhabitants would have dreamed of intervening unless it directly infringed upon their own lives in lost sleep or disturbed routines. It was just the way things were. Words were shouted, blows were delivered, and occasionally apologies were given, or not. Bruises and cuts healed, and things returned to normal. Luckily for Alice, Luckily for Alice, Marjorie had never paid much heed to how other people did things. She cleaned the blood from Alice's face and applied a comfrey paste to the bruises. She asked nothing, and Alice volunteered nothing, except to wince and tighten her jaw at the worst of it. Then, when the girl finally went to bed, Marjorie spoke discreetly to Sven, and they agreed to take it in turns to sit downstairs in the small hours before dawn, so that should Van Cleve come by, he would find that there were circumstances in which a man might not simply drag his wife or his daughter-in-law home again, no matter what public embarrassment that might apparently entail for him. Predictably, for a man used to getting his own way, Van Cleve did come by shortly before dawn, though Alice would never know that, sleeping the sleep of the profoundly shocked in Marjorie's spare room. Marjorie's cabin was not accessible by road, and he was obliged to walk the last half-mile, so that he arrived florid and sweaty despite the snow, a torch held up in front of him. "O'Hare," he roared, and then when no answer came, "O'Hare? You going to answer him?" Sven, who was making coffee, lifted his head. The dog barked furiously at the window, earning a muttered curse from outside. In the stables, Charlie kicked at his bucket. "Don't really see why I should answer a man who won't give me the courtesy of a title, do you?" "No, I don't believe you should," said Sven calmly. He had sat playing solitaire for half the night, one eye on the door, a river of dark thoughts running through his head about men who beat women. "Marjorie O'Hare! Oh Lord, you know he'll wake her if he carries on this loud." Wordlessly, Sven handed Marjorie his gun, and she walked to the screen door and opened it, the rifle held loosely in her left hand as she stepped out onto the stoop, making sure Van Cleve could see it. "Can I help you, Mr. Van Cleve?" "Fetch Alice. I know she's in there." "And how would you know that?" "This has gone far enough. You bring her out and we'll say no more about it." Marjorie stared at her boot, considering this. "I don't think so, Mr. Van Cleve. Good morning." She turned to walk back in and his voice lifted. "What? Wait, you don't shut a door on me." Marjorie turned slowly until she was facing him. "And you don't beat up a girl who answers you back, not a second time. Alice did a foolish thing yesterday. I admit tempers were running high. She needs to come on home now so we can sort things out. In the family." He ran a hand over his face and his voice softened. "Be reasonable, Miss O'Hare. Alice is married. She can't stay here with you." "The way I see it, she can do what she likes, Mr. Van Cleve. She's a grown woman, not a dog or a doll." His eyes hardened. "I'll ask her what she wants to do when she wakes. Now I have work to get to, so I'd be obliged if you'd leave me to wash up my breakfast dishes. Thank you." He stared at her for a moment, his voice lowering. "You think you're mighty clever, don't you, girl? You think I don't know what you did with them letters over at Northridge? You think I don't know about your filthy books and your immoral girls trying to steer good women into the path of sin?" For a few seconds the air seemed to disappear around them. Even the dog fell quiet. His voice, when he spoke again, was thick with menace. "You watch your back, Marjorie O'Hare. You have a nice day now, Mr. Van Cleve." Marjorie turned and walked back inside the cabin. Her voice was calm and her gait was steady, but she stopped by the curtain and watched from the side of the window until she was sure Van Cleve had disappeared. "Where the heck is Little Women? I swear I've been searching for that book for ages. Last time I saw it checked out was for old Peg down at the store, but she says she returned it and it's been signed off in the book." Izzy was scanning the shelves, her finger tracing the spines of the books as she shook her head in frustration. "Albert, Alder, Alamein. Did somebody steal it? Maybe it got ripped and Sophia's fixing it. I asked. She says she ain't seen it. It's bugging me because I've got two families asking and nobody seems to know where it's gone. And you know how ornery Sophia gets when books go missing." She adjusted her stick under her arm and moved to her right, peering closely at the titles. The voices quietened as Marjorie walked through the back door, closely followed by Alice. You got little women tucked away in your bag somewhere, Marjorie. Izzy's bitching fit to burst and woohoo, looks like someone's took a beating. Fell off a horse, said Marjorie, in a tone of voice that brooked no discussion. Beth stared at Alice's swollen face. Then her gaze slid to Izzy, who looked down at her feet. There was a brief silence. Hope you didn't hurt yourself too bad, Alice, said Izzy quietly. Is she wearing your breeches, said Beth. You think I've got the only pair of leather breeches in the state of Kentucky, Beth Pinker? I've never known you so fixated on someone's appearance before. Anyone would think you got nothing better to do. Marjorie walked up to the ledger on the desk and began to flick through it. Beth took the reboot cheerfully. Reckon they look better on her than you anyway. Lord, it's colder than a well digger's backside out there. Anyone seen my gloves? Marjorie scanned the pages. Now, Alice is a little sore, so Beth, you take the 2 weeks over at Bluestone Creek. Miss Eleanor is staying with her sister, so she won't need new books this time round. And Izzy, if you could take the MacArthurs, would that work? You can cut across that 40-acre field to tie in with your usual routes. The one with the falling down barn. They agreed without complaint, sneaking glances at Alice, who said nothing, her attention fixed on some unidentified point 3 feet from her toes, her cheeks burning. As Izzy left, she put out her hand and squeezed Alice's shoulder. Alice waited until they had packed their bags and mounted the horses, and then she sat gingerly on Sophia's chair. You all right? Alice nodded. They sat and listened to the sound of hoofs fading up the road. You know the worst thing about a man hitting you, Marjorie said finally, ain't the hurt. It's that in that instant you realise the truth of what it is to be a woman. That it don't matter how smart you are, how much better at arguing, how much better than them, period. It's when you realise they can always just shut you up with a fist, just like that. Alice remembered how Marjorie's demeanour had changed when the man in the bar had placed himself between them. How her gaze had landed hard where the man touched Alice's shoulder. Marjorie pulled the coffee pot from its stand and cursed as she discovered it was empty. She mulled it over for a moment, then straightened up and flashed Alice a tight smile. Course, you know that only happens till you learn to hit back harder. Despite the daylight hours being now so short, the day ran lengthy and strange. The little library filled with a vague sense of suspense, as if Alice were not quite sure whether she should be waiting for someone or for something to happen. The blows hadn't hurt too much the night before. Now she grasped that was her body's reaction to shock. As the hours crept by, various parts of her had begun to swell and stiffen, a dull throb pushing at parts of her head where it made contact with Van Cleve's meaty fist, or the unforgiven tabletop. Marjorie left after Alice assured her that yes, she was fine, and no, she didn't want any more people missing out on their books, promising to bolt the door all the time she was gone. In truth, she needed time alone, time where she didn't have to worry about everybody else's reactions to her, as well as everything else. And so for a couple of hours it was just Alice in the library, alone with her thoughts. Her head ached too much to read, and she didn't know what to look at anyway. Her thoughts were muddied, tangled. She found it hard to focus, while the questions of her future, where will she live, what to do, whether even to try to return to England, seemed so huge and intractable that eventually it seemed easier simply to concentrate on the small tasks. Tidy some books, make some coffee, step outside to use the outhouse, then return swiftly to bolt the door. At lunchtime there was a knock on the door and she froze, but it was Fred's voice that called. It's only me, Alice. And she raised herself from the chair and slid back the bolt, stepping behind it as he came in. Brought you some soup, he said, placing a bowl with a cloth draped over its rim on the desk. Thought you might be getting hungry. It was then that he saw her face. She registered the shock, suppressed as quickly as it flared, to be supplanted by something darker and angrier. He walked to the end of the room and stood there for a minute, his back to her, and it was as if he was suddenly made of something harder, as if his frame had turned to iron. Bennett Van Cleve is a fool, he said, and his jaw barely moved as he were having trouble containing himself. It wasn't Bennett. It took him a moment to absorb this. Well, damn. He walked back and stopped in front of her. She turned her head away from him, colour rising in her cheeks, as if it were she who had done something to be ashamed of. Please, she asked, and she wasn't sure what she was asking of him. Let me see. He stood before her and lifted his fingertips to her face, studying it with a frown. She closed her eyes as they traced the line of her jaw, his fingers gentle. He was so close she could smell the warmth of his skin, the faint scent of horse he carried on his clothes. You seen a doctor? She shook her head. Can you open your mouth? She obliged, then closed it again with a wince. Brushed my teeth this morning. Think a couple of them may have rattled a bit. He didn't laugh. His fingertips moved up to the sides of her face so gently that she barely felt them, even across the cuts and bruises, the same way they moved softly across a young horse's spine, checking for misalignments. He frowned as they crossed her cheekbones and met her forehead, where he hesitated, then pushed aside a lock of hair. I don't think anything's broken. His voice was a low murmur. Doesn't make me want to hurt him any less, though. It was always the kindness that would kill you. She felt a tear slide slowly down her cheek and hoped he didn't see it. He turned away. She could hear he was now by the desk, clattering a spoon onto it. It's tomato. Made it myself with herbs and a little cream. Figured you wouldn't have brought anything, and it doesn't require chewing. I don't know many men who cook, her voice emerged in a little sob. Yeah, well, would have gone pretty hungry by now if I didn't. She opened her eyes and he was placing the spoon to the side of her bowl, laying a folded gingham napkin neatly beside it. For a moment she had a flashback of the place setting the previous evening, but shoved it down. This was Fred, not Van Cleve, and she was surprised to find that she was hungry. Fred sat while she ate, his feet up in a chair as he read a book of poetry, apparently content to let her be. She ate almost all the soup, wincing every time she opened her mouth, her tongue occasionally working backwards towards the two loose teeth. She didn't speak because she didn't know what to say. A strange and unexpected sense of humiliation hung over her, as if she had somehow brought this on herself, as if the bruises on her face were emblematic of her failure. She found herself replaying and replaying the night's events. Should she have kept quiet? Should she simply have agreed? And yet to do those things would have left her, what, no better than one of those damn dolls? Fred's voice interrupted her thoughts. When I found out my wife was carrying on, I reckon every second man from here to Hoffman asked me why I hadn't given her a good hiding and brought her home again. Alice moved her head stiffly to look at him, but he was studying his book, as if he were reading from the words within it. They said I should teach her a lesson. I never got it, not even in the first flush of anger, when I thought she had pretty much stomped all over my heart. You beat a horse and you can break it all right. You can make it submit, but it will never forget, and it sure as hell won't care for you. So if I wouldn't do it to a horse, I could never work out why I should do it to a human. Alice pushed the bowl away slowly as he continued. Selina wasn't happy with me. I knew it though. I didn't want to think about it. She wasn't made for out here, with the dust and the horses and the cold. She was a city girl, and I probably paid that too little mind. I was trying to build the business after my daddy died. Guess I thought she'd be like my ma, happy to forge her own path. 3 years of it and no babies. I should have known the first sweet-talking salesman to promise her something different would turn her head. But no, I never laid a hand on her, not even when she was standing in front of me, suitcase in hand, telling me all the ways I'd failed to be a man to her. And I reckon half this town still thinks I'm less of a man because of it. Not me, she wanted to tell him, but the words simply wouldn't emerge from her mouth. They sat in silence a while longer, along with their thoughts. Finally, he stood and poured her some coffee, set it before her and walked to the door with an empty bowl. I'll be working with Frank Nilsson's young colt at the near paddock this afternoon. He's a little unbalanced and prefers the level ground. Anything you're worried about, you just bang on that window, okay? She didn't speak. I'll be right here, Alice. Thank you, she said. She's my wife. I've got a right to talk to her. You think I give her Sam Hill what you... Fred got to him first. She'd been dozing in the chair. She felt exhausted to her bones and woke to the sound of voices. It's okay, Fred, she called out. Let him in. She drew back the bolt and opened the door a sliver. Well then, I'm coming in too. Fred walked in behind Bennett so that the two men stood there for a moment, shaking snow from their boots and patting themselves down. Bennett flinched when he saw her. She hadn't dared look at her face, but his expression told her much of what she needed to know. He took a breath and rubbed his palm over the back of his head. You need to come home, Alice, he said, adding, he won't do it again. Since when did you have any say over what your father does, Bennett? She said. He's promised. He didn't mean to hit you that hard. Just a little bit. Oh, that's fine then, said Fred. Bennett shot him a look. Tempers were high. Pa just... Well, he's not used to a woman sassing him. So what's he going to do next time Alice opens her mouth? Bennett turned and squared up to Fred. Hey, Geisler, you want to butt out of this? Because, as far as I can see, this ain't none of your business. It's my business when I see a defenceless woman get beat to a pulp. And you'd be the expert on how to manage a wife, huh? Because we all know what happened to your wife. That's enough, said Alice. She stood slowly. Sudden movements made her head throb, and turned to Fred. Can you leave us for a moment, Fred? Please. His gaze darted from her to Bennett and back again. I'll be right outside, he muttered. They stared at their feet until the door closed. She looked up first, at the man she'd married just over a year ago. A man, she now realised, who had symbolised an escape route rather than any genuine meeting of minds or souls. What had they really known about each other after all? They'd been exotic to one another, a suggestion of a different world to two people who were each trapped in their own way by the expectations of those around them. And then slowly, her difference had become repugnant to him. You coming on home then, he said. Not, I'm sorry, we can fix this, talk it out, I love you, and I've spent the whole night worrying about you. Alice. Not, we'll go somewhere by ourselves, we'll start again, I missed you, Alice. No, Bennett, I'm not coming back. It took him a moment to register what she had said. What do you mean? I'm not coming back. Well, where will you go? I'm not sure yet. You can't just leave. It doesn't work like that. Says who, Bennett? You don't love me. And I can't be the wife you need me to be. We are making each other desperately unhappy, and there's nothing to suggest this is going to change. So no, there's no point in me coming back. This is Marjorie O'Hare's influence. Pa was right, that woman. Oh, for goodness sake, I know my own mind. But we're married. She straightened up. I'm not coming back to that house, and if you and your father drag me out of here 100 times, I will just keep on leaving. Bennett rubbed the back of his neck. He shook his head and turned a quarter away from her. You know he won't accept this. He won't. She watched his face, across which several emotions seemed to be completing with each other, and felt briefly overwhelmed by the sadness of it all, at the admission that this really was it, the end. But there was something else in there, something she hoped he could detect too. Relief. Alice, he said, and there it was again, this bizarre hope, irrepressible as a spring bud, that even at this late hour he might take her into his arms, swear that he couldn't live without her, that this was all a hideous mistake, and that they would be together like he had promised. The belief engraved deep within her that every love story held, at its heart, the potential for a happy ending. She shook her head, and without another word, he left. Right, we'll finish there. Midway through chapter 12, and we'll carry on with chapter 12 next time. Have a great day, everyone. See you later.